When we look at producing club head speed, we can look at two different types of players, for example, that produce the same club head speeds, but in very, very different profiles and very different behaviours. So, for example, much of this is actually controlled by just the shape of the human frame. So the architecture, for example, of the shape of the rib cage and the shape of the pelvis can be then very influential then on really how those players move to then best produce club head speed. So think, for example, of say a Jon Rahm, Tony Finau, the idea of this kind of wide architecture, wide rib cage, wide pelvis, they simply move mass to then produce club head speed. So, and then I could say that the more narrow frame human, the kind of narrow rib cage, narrow pelvis, think say of a Justin Thomas or Will Zalatoris, they produce club head speed through much higher velocities, much more explosive movement. So for example, in these wider humans, a Jon Rahm, a Tony Finau, they simply move mass, which is why they often then move in those kind of very perceived kind of short backswings. They can simply apply those forces, move that mass very quickly over small amounts of time. Whereas on say a Justin Thomas or Will Zalatoris, for example, they're much higher explosive, much more velocity-based players. So there's different profiles of movement which are very much influenced by the simple shape of the frame that player is attempting to move around. And that can then connect into many areas. Movements you can encourage in the golf swing, movements we then look to avoid in the golf swing. So typically the wider frame humans really don't need to rotate as far through backswing, mainly because of the shape of their frame, because they can apply mass, they can move mass over small amounts of time to then produce these high forces. Whereas the narrow human often have much bigger rotations, much more expansions, and a much higher velocity, much more explosive players. Even, for example, in say how we train them, say more so kind of gym-based approaches, often exploring the idea of strength or very, again, relative to who, heavy strength-based training can be hugely helpful for the wider humans, less helpful in some cases for the narrow human. Looking at very explosive movements can often then be hugely helpful for the narrow frame human. Looking at explosive training, deceleration training, almost stabilization training, and that can often be less helpful for the wider human. So again, club head speeds can be produced in very different ways, and it's often very much connected back to the shape of the frame. So for example, wider humans simply move mass, narrow humans are very explosive in their movements. So really ensuring you move aligned with the shape of your frame can then be a hugely advantageous way if they're looking to explore and gain distance.